Hello, good evening. Welcome to the second and final instalment of our Urban Muslimness panel this evening, where we'll be exploring the intersections of the urban and Muslimness. This evening, I'm joined by Professor Peter Hopkins, who will be speaking to the idea of the paper Negotiating Muslim Identity and Islamophobia in Scottish Cities. Professor Hopkins is a professor of social geography at Newcastle University and has published extensively on Islamophobia and Muslimness in Scotland and more generally in Britain. I'm also joined by Dr Kamran Khan, who will be speaking to the paper Muslim Ghettos and Languages, the Cases of the UK and Denmark. Dr. Khan is currently a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Copenhagen and has international expertise exploring Muslimness and citizenship. Next, I'm joined by Christina Longden, whose paper is entitled Muslimness in Victorian Britain. Christina is a published author and is currently writer-in-residence in Kirklees. Christina is involved in multiple charity projects, and she'll be speaking to us this evening about her 3 times great-grandfather, Robert Rashid Stanley, and the books she's written on this. And finally, last but not least, I'm joined by Drs. Naaz, Rashid, and Dr. Victoria Redclift. Their paper is entitled The Burden of Conviviality, British Bangladeshi Muslims Navigating Diversity in London, Luton and Birmingham. Dr. Rashid is lecturer in Media and Cultural Studies at the University of Sussex and has written widely on gender and Muslimness. And Dr. Redcliffe is an associate professor in political sociology at UCL and researches racialized minorities, particularly specializing in British Bangladeshis. I just wanted to thank the panelists and the audience this evening. Looks set to be a great series of papers. Our papers will be followed by a panel discussion. Thank you very much. So if we could begin with Professor Hopkins, over to you.
Thank you. Many thanks to everyone involved in organising the series. I'm sorry I couldn't be on the live thing last week. I had a migraine, unfortunately, but I did listen to it on online. I thought it was lots of very insightful presentations. So hopefully we're going to keep up to the high standard of last week, this week. So the focus here that I'm wanting to draw attention to is around Islamophobia and Muslim identity in the Scottish context. And really, what I want to focus on is a report that I was recently involved in. It was an inquiry into Islamophobia in Scotland, and the main motivation behind this was to address the issue of Scottish exceptionalism. And this is really the point that, you know, Scotland doesn't really address these issues, and there's a sort of approach, an approach informed by exceptionalism that, you know, Scottish people are naturally tolerant and welcoming, and therefore racism isn't a present force in Scottish society. Yet we know from lots of research that that's not the case. So, you know, Miles and Dunlop observed that political processes hadn't been racialised in Scotland the way that they had been in England back in 1987. And although we see a lot of different initiatives celebrating diversity, such as the ones in Scotland Many Cultures, people like Rowena Arshad have pointed out that actually that's one thing, but we've not really done very much to address racism. Myself, I've argued that Scotland's really good at deflecting, displacing and disengaging from the topic of racism. They displace it onto racism, or they displace the racism onto England and say that it's more racist down south. And they've got all these other tactics that you can see when you read sort of political discourse about how they kind of manoeuvre around addressing it rather than they kind of addressing it head on. And so the result is that it doesn't really feature significantly in political or policy discourse. And likewise, Philomena de Lima's done some really interesting work around this, and she's found that it's not really been successfully integrated into debates in social policy. They tend not to look at issues of race and ethnicity. So partly in response to this set of exceptionalisms, I worked with Anas Sarwar, who's now the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, to set up a cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament on tackling Islamophobia. And as part of this cross-party group, we established an inquiry into Islamophobia in Scotland, We asked individuals and organisations about Islamophobia in Scotland, about the role of the media, about its impact on diverse groups in Scotland and what steps could be taken. And this ended up being quite a large piece of work. We had 447 responses to an online survey. And there's some more information on the slide there about the nature of the responses. This was quite a long survey, and it asked about people's experiences of racism, what they thought the challenges and the issues were, and so on, and what they think should address it. So there's some closed questions and some open questions. But overall, 78% identified as with the Islamic faith, and of them, 57% were male and 43% were female. And in terms of the focus on urban Muslimness, most of the responses were urban-based. So 60% of respondents had a Glasgow postcode, 16% Edinburgh, and then there was several other responses from like Aberdeen, Dundee, Falkirk, Kirkcaldy, and Motherwell. And on top of this, we received 15 written submissions to the inquiry from organisations and agencies in Scotland. So this is different groups who work with ethnic and religious minorities or faith-based matters and things like that. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is run through some of the kind of highlight findings, if you like, about where Islamophobia takes place, but I want to try and draw out some of the aspects of it that are relevant to urban Muslimness. So just in terms of some of the highlight points, that I think have been taken up in the media as well. So the survey, 75% of Muslims say that Islamophobia is a regular or everyday issue in Scottish society, and respondents from Glasgow are slightly more likely to report that. So there's something here about the urban nature of this issue, but also it is felt to be more intense in Glasgow than it was elsewhere. And also, of all the respondents, 3/4 said that they felt Islamophobia was getting worse. So again, there's something here about the nature of Islamophobia in urban contexts. And again, of the Muslim respondents, 78% said that it's getting worse, and this rises to 82 for Muslim respondents with a Glasgow postcode. So again, it's Scotland's biggest city, home to the majority of Muslims in Scotland. There's a real issue here around the nature of Islamophobia and where it's happening and why. So those are some of the key findings. One of the things that we tried to look at in a bit more detail was, well, where is this Islamophobia taking place? The street is the location that is most commonly referred to, and after that is public spaces like shops and restaurants and public transport, and then after that it is work and places of education. So again, bear in mind that most of the responses are urban. These are urban streets and urban venues and places that these incidents are taking place. And again, there was some, 31% talked about experiencing it at work, 18% at school, and 13% at college or university, which again are, largely urban-based institutions. There was some variation in age group as well, and again, some of that was about perception as well. And there was talk of it happening at colleges and universities. There was a lot of feedback about the prevent strategy and how Muslim students were being monitored and such like. But again, like a year, Glasgow come up as somewhere that there was a sense that Islamophobia was getting worse. So there's a real issue around that. In terms of actual experiences, 83% of Muslim respondents had experienced Islamophobia directly, and verbal abuse was the most frequently mentioned form. And over 80% of the Muslim respondents to the survey had a friend or a family member who'd experienced Islamophobia as well. And we found that in terms of perceptions of who was most at risk, it was those of South Asian heritage, and that was followed closely by those with an Arabic background. So again, in terms of Muslimness and what it means to be a Muslim, it's the South Asian category that is the most, what seemed to be the most likely for you to experience Islamophobia in that. And then it was if you looked at Arabic, whatever that might mean, came second to that. In terms of the types of Islamophobia, verbal abuse came up a lot. And again, there was more cases of that in Glasgow. There was lots of cases of public transport, and people are travelling to or from work or to or from college or university. And respondents also noticed a number of attacks on mosques and other buildings that are seen to be associated with Muslims. So again, it's important to emphasise there that this isn't just about Islamic buildings. It was religious buildings that might be perceived to be Muslim. So not all the cases were necessarily against the Islamic religion per se. Some of them were just buildings that were perceived to be possibly associated with Islam. And perhaps not surprisingly to the people here, gendered Islamophobia was a real issue. People often pointed out its gendered nature, and in particular its negative and disproportionate impact on women. And in particular, the kind of comment or issue that came up most frequently was a concern about the hijab, and in particular a concern about having this pulled off in public. And that was a real worry for a lot of the women. Well, not just women, but men responded with that as well. So these are some of the kind of background information about the experiences, but we do have more kind of detail around this. But in particular, in relation to the issue around urban Muslimness, that's the focus of this panel and last week's panel, we did collect some data. There was some evidence in the submissions around the issue of, Muslimness being this quite contested category, and it wasn't just about being Muslim. It could affect people from a diverse range of ethnic and religious backgrounds who were seen to be or perceived to be Muslim or misrecognised as Muslim. So the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights in Glasgow, which was Glasgow Anti-Racist Alliance quite some time ago, they're a very active anti-racist organisation in Glasgow. They quote a recent study about experiences of young people from a whole range of different backgrounds and how they were regularly mistaken for being Muslim. So what, and this was in Scotland. So again, it wasn't just about being Muslim. It was Sikhs, Hindus, other South Asian young people who were basically, victims of racism because they were seen to be or perceived to be Muslim. So there's a real issue around that. And they actually pointed this out in their submission. And then we also received a submission from the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, and they pointed out that they were aware that there's a number of members of the Jewish community who'd been subjected personally to anti-Muslim abuse. So this is where I think that the organisers putting this together, it's really interesting to frame this around urban Muslimness, because it does encapsulate a lot more than just the Muslim community, potentially. And there is this really interesting issue around misrecognition and how this works. And of course, part of the issue around misrecognition is it's easy to kind of just say, well, it's just a mistake, or I didn't mean it, or don't take it too seriously, those types of things. But in the end, it is a form of racism, and it's a racist misrecognition that people have been associated as belonging to a particular group that they don't belong to. So my view would be that misrecognition is a form of racism, particularly when it happens in a very explicit and sort of nasty way. So that's just some thoughts there around the theme of urban Muslimness and in particular reference to misrecognition. And if anyone's interested in looking at the public inquiry documents in any more detail, there is an executive summary and a full report that goes into this in a lot more detail, and that's available on Anna Sarwar's website. The link is at the top there, and that kind of gives you the full detail and the background to the inquiry and how we conducted it and whatever. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing the other presentations and to addressing any questions in the panel at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Peter. I really thought that was an interesting insight into sort of problematising the so-called Scottish exceptionalism, this idea that Islamophobia or racism more broadly is a problem down south, but also I think importantly highlighting the gaps in policy and practice that actually emerge there and the necessity for that fantastic empirical inquiry that you've carried out. I really like this idea as well of the perceived as Muslim and the way in which it touches people and place, really highlighting, and I think Professor Sayed, who spoke last week, speaks to this in his work as well, highlighting that it is a broader problem. It is not just an issue of Muslimness, rather there is that essentialization of Muslimness that is affecting society more generally in a multiplicity of ways. Thank you so much, Peter. On to our next speaker now. We've got Dr. Khan speaking to on his paper, Muslim Ghettos and Languages, a comparative study of the UK and Denmark. Over to you, Dr.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me and for the space to talk about these issues, and thank you to everyone who's attending tonight. So I'm going to talk about kind of three big kind of areas of separateness in terms of urban Muslimness, Muslims, ghettos, so really spatial arrangements and kind of areas where there's so-called parallel lives, and also languages. So there's kind of degrees of variations of separateness we see in kind of media and political discourses. I'm sure many of you are familiar with many of these, and often this is kind of indexes a type of lack of integration, or sometimes even a kind of lawlessness in the case of no-go areas, for example. As you see here, I've got a kind of list of 4 things: no-go areas, enclaves, parallel lives, and ghettos. I'm sure there's plenty more. I'm going to focus on parallel lives and ghettos, but I'll just quickly go through some of these. We've seen no-go areas, particularly most famously in the case of Fox News, talking about Birmingham as a kind of no-go area for non-Muslims, and that was kind of retracted later. We've seen the case of enclaves of Islam in the Sunday Times, where they talked about this kind of survey that was run at a school, where there were enclaves of Islam which see the UK as 75% Muslim. So this kind of insular nature of the arrangements within cities. So just 2 things to keep in mind, because I'm going to talk, I don't want to go too heavy into theories about language, but just 2 things to keep in mind. The idea of language ideology. So generally what we think about a language and the way we treat languages, whether we exalt them or whether we discriminate against them, quite often that applies to the communities and the speakers of those languages. And what we're interested in here is the kind of racialization of language, so the way that race and language intersect. So I'm going to, just for the sake of time, focus on 3 kind of moments in the last 20 years or so in the UK. So for the UK part, that's what I'm going to focus on. Now I'm going to go back to 2001, and there were these riots in the north of England in 3 cities. And there'd been this escalating tension over that summer between far-right extremists and local British Asian communities. And it kind of escalated to the point where communities felt they weren't protected by the police. And there were these kind of scenes, as you can see on screen. A year later, 3 reports talked about how the causes of these riots. And a lack of English was one of the blames, among other things. And the idea was that there was these parallel lives, which was the kind of key phrase from the Cantle report, which meant that white British and British Muslims were kind of not communicating and speaking together. And what we see there is the way that language is kind of used to implicitly blame British Muslims in this case, because it's their lack of English. And as a result of this, what they did was, in bringing these kind of fragmented communities together, they used kind of the national language and citizenship. So they introduced English language requirements to become a British citizen. So that was one way of kind of protection against this type of violence. So you see the kind of cause and solution here in some ways is the language issue, having a common language. So I'm just going to move on to 2014 and the Trojan horse case. I'm assuming most people are familiar with this, but just very quickly for those who don't know, in Birmingham there was this hoax letter that proclaimed that there was an Islamic takeover of inner city schools in mostly Muslim areas. What I want to focus on is this kind of profile that kept being repeated in the Clark report that came afterwards. Now, for each school in that report, there's this kind of brief profile that gives you some sort of some background about that school. So this is Adderley Primary School. I just used it as I just chose one. And as you can see, Adderley Primary has 605 children enrolled. Okay. 56.9% of whom are eligible for free school meals. So kind of gives us an idea about issues of the kind of socioeconomics of the area. 99.4% of children are from minority ethnic backgrounds. And then you see in red, 9.7% speak English as a first language. So this kind of adds to the kind of separateness and otherness of the kind of school population. And just note here, they're not saying that they don't speak English. They're saying that they don't speak it as a first language, presumably at home. So it's actually not a proficiency issue. It's an issue that there's this kind of separateness and otherness that's kind of going on in the private sphere at home. So if you go through the report, I mean, we don't need to go through all of it here, but it constantly brings up the percentages of English as a first language. So if you kind of keep that in mind with what happened in 2001, and there's plenty of other examples of this, it kind of adds to this kind of unease about what makes Muslims separate. In 2015, then the government published this counter-extremism strategy as well. And as you can see, by this point, there's a section about English language training. So again, that has this kind of racializing kind of effect in as much marking out a particular demographic that seem to be not speaking English. So you can see English and learning is not necessarily only an educational aspect. It's not even, it goes beyond civic engagement and education, but it's actually a protection against and mitigation against kind of violence and radicalization. So as we can see, then there's this kind of multiple securitization for kind of what are seen as linguistically deficient Muslims, whether they are or they're not, but they're presented this way. And that's on the one hand, and then we know from even in the last few days, some of the issues around prevent in the way it's particularly perceived and implemented. So that takes us on to the case of Denmark. And as you can see, you'll start seeing kind of similarities. So my point isn't that one follows after the other, but there are kind of chains of discourse and kind of shared discourses and policy kind of directions. This is a policy document that was published in 2018. And for those who maybe don't speak so much Danish, the title of this document is Denmark Without Parallel Societies, No Ghettos in 2013. So it's, you know, raising a lot of the issues from before. So it's really interesting when we start delving into what makes a ghetto in this case. We don't need to go through the whole background of this, but basically the Danish government can designate particular areas as ghettos within the country. And of importance, particularly for this 2018 document, was if you look at the first circle, this idea of non-Western ethnicities. So already we can see the kind of racializing effect of this. If we go to the first, the first point of the second circle, more than half of the residents may be from non-Western ethnicities. This applies to migrants, naturalized citizens, and even their Danish-born descendants. So you can see the way in which it's, it's very much characterizes particular groups in this way. In terms of language, so this comes from the Euromed Human Rights Monitor. One of the issues that comes up within all of this is learning Danish and the role of Danish within these ghettos. What are perceived as ghetto children whose families receive welfare benefits must be separated from their parents at the age of 1 for at least 25 hours per week, excluding nap time, to be enrolled in state kindergartens with a maximum migrant intake of 30%. So I think the issue here is that once they go to kindergarten and they're away from their parents, that the kindergarten has to have particularly people, non-ghetto Danish children. Otherwise, the family would lose welfare benefits. The goal is for the ghetto children to receive mandatory instructions in Danish values, including the traditions of Christmas and Easter, as well as learn the Danish language. Meanwhile, non-ghetto residents in Denmark can choose whether to enroll their kids in preschool up to the age of 6. Ghetto children, as they kind of referred to in the documents, must also undergo a Danish language test before being admitted to school, or otherwise receive intensive Danish courses and attend a summer school to start grade. So again, we see here the kind of assimilating effect of the dominant national language, in particularly the security of producing the national community. So you can kind of see echoes here of the language as a solution here for a particular problem of multilingualism. So within the same policy document, then they also have a section which is an actual national action plan on prevention and control of extremism and radicalization. So we see the way it's all framed in very similar ways to what we saw in the UK. So we have an identification of a somewhat problematic or suspect group, who they are, where they are located, and how they are perceived to communicate. We see profiling around race, class, religion, and language. And what we've seen in research, so one academic paper I'm just referring to here, is that sometimes there is a self-stigmatization from racially minoritized students around their kind of multilingualism. So this was one article by Anne Holman, who talked about, in which one student talked about being bilingual means being a foreigner. So even though this person was for all intents and purposes Danish, they felt that this kind of marked them out compared to other Danish students. And one of the things, as someone who's moved to Denmark and started there recently, is Danish people speak really great English. So it's not a case of all multilingualism. It's a particular bilingualism which attaches itself onto kind of racially minoritized populations. So just some concluding thoughts then. We see the way integration, so the whole point of all of this is somehow all of the kind of groups we've talked about are not integrated in some way. We see it's kind of co-opted within countering violent extremism. So it's not necessarily about education learning or kind of civic kind of support and kind of responsibilities. It's actually a mitigation against kind of extremism. The stigma around non-dominant languages associated with Muslims as a kind of source of problems. And a lot of this tells us that actually about the anxieties of the national community and why it makes them anxious. So those are some things to think about. So for those interested, I'm actually at the very beginning of studying all of this at the University of Copenhagen. So if you're interested, this is CV Lang, the project I'm working on, and I have a project and personal accounts on Twitter where I talk about security and language and a lot of the issues that arise from this. So if you're interested, I'm at the beginning of all of this, so I hope to share more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamran. It was really interesting to hear your insights here. I think it's an area that tends to be neglected. We don't tend to think so heavily about the role of language and the signifying work that does. Thank you for sharing as well your accounts. I'm sure I speak for the other panelists and the audience members. We're keen to see how this develops. I thought it was really interesting how you spoke about these enclaves or parallel societies and parallel lives. It's something I've seen replicated in my work in Francophone Europe. So it's definitely, I would argue, a global trend as you highlighted. Again, really interesting is this issue around the type of bilingualism that is either acceptable or deemed suspect. And I think that interrogation is something that we really need to bring to the fore, and the way in which sort of whiteness is a sort of precluding factor to these ghettos. So whiteness means, even if it is non-Danish whiteness, we could somehow avoid these ghettos. So I really like the way in which you've problematized and brought forward some of the elements that we perhaps don't readily think about. Thank you so much for your contribution. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions to follow later. Thank you. So now on to our next speaker. We've got Christina Longden, who'll be speaking about Muslimness in Victorian Britain. So over to you, Christina.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm going to be looking at, I suppose, one method that I've been working on, which is a way of challenging perceptions of Muslimness through really the prism of Victorian Muslim converts, which I'm sure many of people watching today will be very familiar with. I'm going to be talking about one person in particular who's my great-great-great-grandfather, and I'll be looking at it, I guess, through the intersectionality of class and faith, in particular his experiences. So his life has been resurrected. He was I like to say, the hidden Victorian Muslim, and he's captured people's imagination, really. There's been a lot of attention into his life, mainly because he was a Muslim in urban Manchester, really. I'm going to be talking about places called Stalybridge and Ashton, just near the Oldham border of Manchester. But also it was the research, really, that uncovered for me in particular how he perceived himself. And it wasn't particularly anything to do with being a Muslim as separate from anybody else. So I'll explain a little bit more about the way that he lived his life. But I think the bottom line is, even though he didn't perceive himself in this way, certain authorities did perceive him as being a Muslim and being a person of interest and being a dangerous person. And a lot of this boils down to British foreign policy, which is really kind of explained why his life took the course that it did, really. But just to go back a little bit. Our family knew nothing about this person other than he was my great-great-great-grandfather. We were quite proud of this person because he'd been a mayor of Stalybridge. He had been a councillor. He had been married for 53 years to his wife. He was the father of 11 children living in a tiny 2-bedroom house. And he died at the age of 83 in 1911, which is a pretty good innings. He was also a magistrate, which was highly unusual for a working class person. He was a grocer and he was a tea trader. So his expertise really was on tea blends. And he was registered at the Manchester Corn Exchange. And we knew that on leaving politics, he became a publican. So he owned a pub, which is still there in Ashton, underlined today, with his family. We also knew that his grandson, my grampy, who I remember very well, took on the political legacy, really, of him becoming the mayor of Stalybridge as well. So the Stanleys were a very respectable working class family. Now, then we discovered the backstory, the really interesting stuff. And this all came about when my dad was made redundant. My dad's on the photograph there, the man in the fez. And he decided to throw himself into his family history. And somebody, a relative, presented him with a very small magazine, which you can see up there, which says The Religions of Japan. And that is an edition of The Crescent, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the first Islamic publication in the UK. The magazine produced by Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, probably the most famous Victorian Muslim convert of all. And there was a feature article of Robert. He was named as Rashid in the article, and you can see a picture of him there. The only other picture that we had of him where he's wearing a fez. That's a photograph of Quilliam down there, just below the picture of Rashid Stanley. And the next thing that we found was a fez. So another relative, for some bizarre reason, had held on to this fez and presented it to my dad and said, well, I think this is something to do with Robert. And lo and behold, it's the very same fez that he's wearing in that photograph. But the real astonishing synchronicity of all of this was that my brother, Stephen, who's in the middle of the photograph of us all up there, he converted to Islam 30 years ago now. So he'd already been a Muslim for over a decade, thinking he's the only white working class bloke in Manchester at the time to convert to Islam. And lo and behold, his own great-great-grandfather had done it. So it was an amazing discovery. And we made more and more discoveries. To bear in mind, we had hardly any information on this man. And then photographs such as the one down in the bottom right-hand corner there, which is a bit faded, that's my great-great-great-granddad sitting behind Quilliam at the Liverpool Mosque. So it was an amazing discovery, and it was an amazing journey as well. And I think talking about his life and doing so much research on it now, as I have done, I think it's just been such an eye-opening process for us as a family. And you may think, okay, you know, you probably know more about Islam because you have, you know, Muslims obviously in your family. But actually, we've learned more and more about people's perceptions of what it means to be a Muslim. Perhaps because I've spent a lot of time now doing a much bigger version of this talk to communities in the UK, both Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think the really interesting bit for me is his life after he converted. That this is the bit that people think it would have changed. So he's now spending a lot of time to and from the train line to Manchester to Liverpool and back, spending time in the Liverpool Mosque. Quilliam appointed him almost immediately as the vice president of the Liverpool Muslim Institute, the mosque. But the very interesting thing was, nearly all of the converts that we know about were middle class or upper class, and you'll probably be aware of some of their names. And they all travelled abroad. They all got time to study and reflect. Now, Robert ran a tea grocer's shop. There were no diaries kept as far as we know. There was nothing written down by the family. Nobody knew about it at all. Even my gran, the direct link to Robert, was only ever told that he was a Rechabite, which nobody knew what that was, and it turns out it means somebody that practiced temperance. So the family story, the family spin on the entire thing might well have been, we're not keen on saying that he was a Muslim, but we'll say he didn't drink, because obviously being a temperant was a big thing in those days. So he basically carried on his life as it had been before, although he moved into Manchester city centre. And we think that this might well be because Quilliam, who was obviously one of his best friends by this point, wanted him to set up a mosque and to integrate within the, I suppose, the trading community of Muslims who moved to the UK from overseas, who he met through the Corn Exchange, to set up a more, I suppose, integrated community there. But he still carried on doing what he did. He was still acting as a magistrate. He still spent a lot of time in Stalybridge. And when he died, he actually came back to be buried in Stalybridge, where he'd sort of spent the last really 2 or 3 years of his life. So to a certain degree, not a lot did change for him. But of course, we don't have a lot of information because our family, for whatever reasons, chose not to talk about this for 100 years. So it really did require a lot of research, shall we say, and a lot of excavation. So when he did die in 1911, there was this silence, and there was nobody talked about it. And there's various theories as to why. He was seen to be a great Turcophile. He wrote, and this is the bit that never ceases to amuse me, to the Caliph from his pub. This is before he converted. From his pub in Ashton, he was writing to the head of the Ottoman Empire, giving him advice on things like trade, on military decisions. He asked for the first translation of the Quran into English to be made by a Muslim, because he said the only existing translation that we got is by a Christian. So how could you possibly read this, unbiased? And I suppose some people would have thought, well, he's got ideas above his station. But the bit that particularly interests me, and that I found myself through working with and having friends and family who are Muslims from very different backgrounds and very different ethnic groups in the UK, is this element of needing to be self-taught. Now, Robert began work at the age of 10 as an apprentice. He never had a formal education. The only writing that we've ever had access to was when he was asked down to Parliament as an expert witness on whether the secret ballot should be introduced to protect people's voting rights. He was such an eloquent man. He was forever writing to the newspapers, to people like the Caliph, and he learned all of this by himself. And he read so much, and he must have devoured newspapers. He got to know David Urquhart, who's a very interesting person to read upon, who was again a Turcophile, who gave a different spin on the kind of thing that he would have been reading in the newspapers. And as Robert spent time at the Manchester Corn Exchange with traders from all around the world, he would have had a very different version of British foreign policy and what was actually happening to people overseas. And he quite early on in his life became convinced that Muslim populations in particular were being persecuted by the result of British foreign policy. So he was a self-taught person, and I think this is something that we do overlook in terms of working class communities during particularly the Victorian period. There was so much emphasis placed on becoming self-taught, on learning, and even if you weren't literate, you had a much stronger connection with foreign policy and what was happening overseas, because nearly everything that landed on your table and the cotton in the mills relied on the way that the British were behaving overseas and on the trading links. So I would actually say, even though we've got the internet, at our fingers at the moment, and we can use it for however we want to use it, many of the working class people back in the previous century, they were actually more educated and more aware of world affairs than many people are today. So I think he was amazing in terms of the fact that he elevated himself really to becoming the mayor of the first working class that we're aware of in the region. But he still lived a very humble life. That's the house in Stalybridge that he died in. It's still there. And I suppose the sad side of the story is when he did die, he was buried at St Paul's in Stalybridge. That's his gravestone there. So he didn't have a Muslim burial as far as we are aware. And again, there's no evidence of any of this other than he was put into the family grave. But being working class Northern, I would imagine he would say, I paid for that grave, I'm going in it. And Quilliam, who fled the country in 1908, was back in the country with his new identity by 1911. So I'm pretty sure the two of them would have been in touch. Who knows what would have happened, whether Quilliam would have been there doing Muslim prayers at the funeral. I don't know. Unfortunately, we found out about the grave just 2 months before it was demolished. The church wanted to build a car park over that section of the graveyard, and we applied, but we were not allowed because we were told we had to give more notice to claim the headstone. But we got a photograph of it. And I think in terms of perception of belonging, in terms of perception who our community is, in terms of perception of loyalty, this picture on the right of the new headstone, I think speaks to me more than anything. Out of all the research that I've done and all the talks that I've done, this little picture was mocked up by a 12-year-old boy at one of the Manchester talks that I did, who was so moved. hearing Robert's story in his life and what he achieved and the fact that the grave went, he mocked up his own headstone and he wrote a poem in his honour about what kind of a man he was. And I think the privilege that I felt to have been able to tell this story to Muslims and non-Muslims who have responded in well, overwhelmingly positive ways. So these are the two books that I've researched and written about in, and any of you that are in Milton Keynes, I'm doing the big talk in Milton Keynes at the Art Gallery next Saturday. I'd love for you to come along to that. But the biographical history is his own man. And the particular, I suppose, the bits of interest to many people, which cannot be covered by a factual discussion of his life and his journey towards Islam and what his perception of becoming a Muslim was, is covered in Imagining Robert. So these are the questions that often came up at the end of the talks. I've kind of imagined it into a work of fiction that's I would call creative non-fiction. And I think just to kind of summarize, really, I found it really interesting that when I've got a mixed audience of Muslim and non-Muslims, often the questions that are asked about him, I can almost predict the questions that are going to come up. Just as a quick example, Muslims always tend to be more interested in the grave, the burial. Why was this covered up? Why were your family either ashamed, or what had happened to deny, the knowledge of what this man had gone to achieve? Just simple things like, where did he go to pray when he came back to live in Staither Bridge? And did he ever go on Hajj? The answer is no, he never left the country, which I think is even more remarkable, because all the other upper class and middle class converts from the Victorian era had enough money to go overseas. Robert just worked and worked. And why did his family not convert? Did his family convert? And the non-Muslims tend to focus on questions like, what did his wife think? What did his daughters think? Isn't it a bit hypocritical to be running a pub and deciding that you want to be a Muslim? And I guess the answer is no, because he sold the pub. And again, they're quite interested in his burial. And in particular, in terms of, I suppose, the strongest analogy that I've found is during the 1860s, some of the biggest problems in the north, which were the bread riots, the Lancashire cotton famine, and the Murphy riots, very much focused on the newly arrived Irish population. In Ashton and Staither Bridge, for example, during the 1860s, almost overnight, the population became 50% Irish. So it's very easy for, I suppose, non-Muslims in the area who have this issue of immigration going on to relate very strongly to what it would have been like then. So we're able to focus on issues such as, the others arriving and they're being different and they're having a different faith to us and being a threat. And I think I've just found it, I suppose, it has been a privilege to be doing this work, because it's given people a safe space. It's not your usual local authority run workshop where people have to come along and told to get on with each other, and it's got the community cohesion label on it, and it's all about diversity. It's just a fantastic story of an astonishing man with a secret that has absolutely nothing to be ashamed of, but is everything to be celebrated. And I think I suppose the payoff as well is that when you come along and you hear this kind of a story and you're there in the room with somebody that normally you wouldn't ask them that question about, why do you do that and why we do this, it basically brings people together. People we've had very emotional sessions where people have actually said they've got more out of this than, the last 20 years of being in a community alongside Muslim people that they've never really felt that they can chat to about their faith or about what it believes. So I suppose it's a story of authenticity, and it brings it back to contemporary Islamophobia. And the fact is that, he experienced that then, the community in Liverpool experienced that, and even more so today. So I think, it's great to sort of have somebody like Robert's history being uncovered, and I'm hoping that this is a beginning of more working class Muslim converts from that era being uncovered and being celebrated. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. I think that was just fascinating, and I'm sure our audience will agree. It's a real privilege to hear about your 3 times great grandfather and his experiences. And like you said there, it is, I guess, and from your practitioner background as well, we're potentially seeing a new way of doing, moving away from these community cohesion labels, moving away from these enclave labels and parallel live labels. There are different ways of understanding the history of Muslimness in Britain as perhaps not being so markedly different and separate, rather something that's been interwoven through time and history, through different lenses that we don't normally consider. And I'm sure our audience will have plenty of questions, so please do fire away if you have anything you wanted to ask Christina about that. But thank you again, Christina, for your contribution. Then moving on to our final paper, we've got Dr Naaz, Rashid and Dr Victoria Redclift giving their paper, The Burden of Conviviality, British Bangladeshi Muslims Navigating Diversity in London, Luton and Birmingham. Over to you both. Thank you.
So thank you to the organisers for inviting us to participate in this series, and also to the previous panellists both this week and last week. So the focus of our talk will be a recently published article in the journal Sociology, which Victoria and I co-authored with Fatima Rajana, which draws on research with British Bangladeshis in 3 UK cities. The research, which Vic will discuss in more detail, draws attention to the ways in which structural racism continues to operate within seemingly harmonious appearances of conviviality. Before discussing the paper in detail, I just wanted to make a few comments on the idea of urban Muslimness. So from my own perspective, I first started thinking about this when doing my PhD research in 2008. I was looking at policies around Muslim women as part of the UK's counter-terrorism agenda, PREVENT. And my fieldwork was multi-sited as it followed the initiatives which were taking place in areas with substantial Muslim populations. Many of you will know that PREVENT funding was allocated according to the number of Muslims in a local authority. So my research sites included Cardiff, Bristol, Bradford, and 3 different boroughs in London. And so although I hadn't specifically planned to look at the geographical differences, the contrast in how the policies and initiatives played out in different places made this unavoidable. East London, Birmingham and Bradford immediately evoke all the alleged ills of multiculturalism. Particular cities and districts within cities, such as Manningham in Bradford and Tower Hamlets in East London, have become emblematically problematic of the various crises of multiculturalism touted in the media and in policy narratives. So what struck me while I was doing my research was, despite the similarities in these diverse cities, they were diverse in their diversity. So not only were the demographics different, the histories of migration and the nature and composition of the Muslim presence also varied. Moreover, the histories of anti-racist struggles and engagement with the state at both local and national level were different too. In Bristol, for example, I heard about the inter-ethnic and class tensions between Muslims of Somali and Pakistani heritage, as well as different experiences of policing and surveillance. In the London Borough of Brent and in Cardiff, I heard about the fracturing of South Asian solidarities on religious lines and the death of political blackness before then. I heard about the influence of Arab migration in Bristol and the hierarchies of Muslimness that this revealed. I heard about biculturalism in Bradford, where narratives of parallel lives and self-segregation produced misjudged policies of community cohesion across the country that were even less relevant than they were in Bradford. Considering urban Muslimness, therefore, requires looking at how the experiences of Muslims are complicated by region and the different demographics and historical contexts associated with that. In current debates about regional inequality between the left behind Red Wall and London's so-called metropolitan elites, we see the erasure of race and religion. Likewise, discussions about the Muslim experience can often collapse together very diverse experiences, including that of regional inequality, leaving in their place crude culturalist and essentialist analysis. So the analysis in our paper is foregrounded by the need to acknowledge this and intersectionality more generally, taking into account gender and generation, for example. The paper, which Vic will discuss in more detail, draws on in-depth qualitative interviews with British Bangladeshi Muslims in London, Luton and Birmingham. In London, the research was focused on Tower Hamlets, where almost half of the UK's Bangladeshi population is located. Luton was chosen as a satellite town to London because it represents an interesting comparator to Tower Hamlets with regard to ethnic concentration. Luton is also the home of the English Defence League, a far-right anti-Muslim organisation, and has received significant media attention as a result. The region with the second highest concentration of British Bangladeshi Muslims in the UK is the West Midlands, with the majority living in the city of Birmingham, where one of the largest concentrations is in the ward of Aston. As made clear in this series, the city has played a vital role in shaping the politics of race in British society. Furthermore, as religion has increasingly become a key theme in contemporary political debate, Birmingham has continued to feature in public commentary as a site of concern, notably in relation to education, for example, the Trojan horse affair and the No Outsiders controversy. So in the paper, we discuss the British Bangladeshi Muslim experience in these three sites in the context of the convivial turn in migration and diversity studies. Conviviality has been conceptualized by some as the ability to be at ease in the presence of diversity. However, insufficient attention has been paid to considering who is affectively at ease with whose differences, or more particularly, what the work of conviviality requires of those marked as other vis-a-vis European white normativity.
So what we're talking about today, as Naaz explains, is the work required of some in everyday mundane interactions, which were not always seen as much as felt. We argue that the literature on conviviality has sometimes obscured this background labour required of some but not others to ameliorate the interrogation of difference, which was in fact at play. We discuss three types of labour, as Naaz explained from the paper, but obviously for reasons of time, we're just going to focus on one of those. We're going to focus on the work of appearing unremarkable. As many of our participants showed, appearing unremarkable could involve expressive emotion work too. So this is a quote from Afsana, 21, from Tower Hamlets. She says, "I feel like I have to act a certain way so people don't think I'm bad. I have to be more smiley. I have to be more nice. Why do I have to do that? When I'm on the train going somewhere far and I see all these people and they're looking at me strangely and I open up my smile more and stuff like that. Whoever I'm with, I'm like, oh my God, no, just talk English when I'm outside. So they know I know their language and I'm one of them. I'm like, don't talk Bengali because they're going to think, is she plotting something? All these things come to my head. That's why I feel like I have to be not myself when I'm outside sometimes. That's what I mean by freedom. A little bit of my freedom is gone." So Naaz mentioned the focus within some of the conviviality literature on this idea of being at ease in the presence of diversity. But as Afsana highlights, being effectively at ease is a matter of interpretation. Afsana feels she has to be more smiley on the outside, but it causes her pain and frustration on the inside. So whose perspectives or experiences disappear in or behind this conviviality? As Amira here notes, the pain and frustration took a heavy toll. Yet in contrast to some of the other participants, most of the participants actually, she acknowledges these instances as the result of racism. So she's 24 from Tower Hamlets also. In Tower Hamlets, I went to a particular school just down the road. It's 99% Bengali, probably. So I've never really felt different. Then you go to a particular Russell Group university in central London, and it's almost all white. And there was very everyday racism, but I would brush it off. And I was known as a good brown person because I'd get along with everyone. I didn't know that when people ask if you shower with your hijab, I didn't realize that was othering and racism. That was an everyday experience and it ground me down. And I used to come home and cry and tell my mum I didn't want to go to uni anymore. It's just how much energy I have to invest in being someone who I'm not, having that mask on. You shouldn't have to be like that, but it's survival really. So both Afsana and Amira here discuss something very specific to the Tower Hamlets experience, the moments when you leave it behind. Afsana talks about being on the train, going somewhere far, and Amira contrasts her experience in a local Tower Hamlets school to her experience at university in central London. As we discuss in more detail in the article, evidence of the burden of conviviality appeared most often in the Tower Hamlets data. And all of our data on appearing unremarkable came from Tower Hamlets. This surprised us at first, as we expected to find the burden less often in Tower Hamlets than elsewhere. But as we dug into the data, we discovered that it often appeared in reference to leaving Tower Hamlets behind. So Simu here, 46, talked about feeling comfortable in Tower Hamlets and was asked how she felt when she was outside the borough. She says, yeah, so anytime I've gone, let's say, further north, going to like countryside, you get the odd stare. You're someone they don't see every day. Actually, there was this one occasion when I opened my mouth and she realized I spoke English. And then she was like, wait, what? It was really quite odd. So in one sense, the size of the British Bangladeshi community in Tower Hamlets appeared to provide some protection from the burden of conviviality. But frequent movement in and out of the borough may also have made this burden more apparent. The borough's prominence within the British Bangladeshi imagination as the heartland of the Bangladeshi community, as well as its geographic proximity to the metropole, may heighten consciousness among British Bangladeshis around how to navigate and manage the way they are othered.
So I'm just going to try and I'm going to set out the conclusions from our article. So just to summarize then, our article addresses the work required of those marked as inferior vis-a-vis white normativity in everyday interaction, which may otherwise be deemed convivial. In doing so, we draw attention to the variation in power relations active in different spaces, which has been missing from some of the conviviality literature. In particular, we demonstrate the burden of putting other people at ease on those racialized as South Asian and Muslim, and how broader discourses of anti-Muslim racism, which build on earlier and parallel forms of anti-South Asian racism, are both internalized and resisted in everyday encounters. Interviewees described how they felt pressure to explain or defend their religion or overcome negative stereotypes by offering alternative representations to mainstream narratives. They described how they felt obliged to avoid playing the race card so as not to appear unprofessional and to let it go when they experienced racist abuse. Many took for granted the need to appear unremarkable in public space, to smile on the bus, to blend in with those around them, and to speak English loudly to show they belonged. We argued that the literature on conviviality and multicultural has focused on ease in the presence of diversity, obscuring the background labor required of some but not others, to ameliorate the interrogation of difference. Moreover, we argue that the literature on anti-Muslim racism needs to be brought into conviviality debates. What we have termed the burden of conviviality, with its hidden labor, is an expression of established racist structures which are multi-layered and the outcome of different forms of racialization, as both South Asian and as Muslim. Our participants' responses to this burden varied. Some sought to challenge it, while others attempted to avoid it. However, we argue that the burden echoes the narrative that racism is principally about individual encounters and thus can only be addressed through interpersonal adaptation and accommodation, an idea arguably enshrined in community cohesion policies. Through this narrative, normative whiteness is upheld and established racist structures ensure that the burden of conviviality is not borne by everyone. The work of education and explanation was discussed by men and women in all field sites, but it became a particular focus for conversation amongst young women concerning the need to justify choices around dress and veiling. In a similar way, the work of understanding racism came out in the narratives of both men and women across all three field sites. However, because not blaming others for anti-Muslim racism was often expressed with reference to visibility, women discussed this labor of empathy or letting it go more frequently. There was a generational dimension too, as younger women called out experiences of anti-Muslim racism that older participants were inclined to ignore or forget. Finally, all our data on the work of appearing unremarkable came from women, and all of those women were between the ages of 18 and 46. Moreover, this data emerged from Tower Hamlets. We suggest that these participants possibly became more aware of the burden of conviviality when they left the relatively safe East London borough, and proximity to the metropole may heighten consciousness around how to navigate and manage the way they are othered. Gender, generation, and space are therefore clearly important in determining who is confronted more often by anti-South Asian and anti-Muslim racism, how that is experienced, and who is in the position of accommodating whom. So the burden of conviviality is placed on the shoulders of those racialized vis-a-vis white normativity to educate, understand, and put at ease those not racialized as different. The efforts of the participants to blend in is instructive of the powerful ways they are positioned against the dominant culture. This becomes the blueprint for surviving the burden of conviviality, disappearing into normative whiteness. Our data suggests then that until diversity itself is seen as unremarkable, this burden is sometimes accepted, sometimes resisted, but always unevenly distributed.
Thank you so much, Naaz and Victoria. That was a really interesting and insightful presentation there, particularly focusing on a particular or a specific racialized ethnic group that others have touched on in their presentations, and the role of language as well. I really liked what you said, Naaz, about the potentially unavoidable focus on the urban, and this is the rationale that myself and the organisers of this came to, really, that there is this potentially unavoidable intersection or interconnectedness of the urban and Muslimness, and it's about time we sort of really focused on that and began to interrogate, problematize, but also highlight some of the lived reality there. Also really liked this idea of kind of, or found it a really useful tool, this idea of appearing unremarkable and the burden of conviviality. In my own work, I know I've talked about it sort of through the lens of performativity. You kind of mentioned the challenging or avoiding this burden of conviviality. I've also looked at the way in the French context, women, Muslim women in particular, have tried to subvert some of this. So really playing with some of that white normativity to then challenge dominant perceptions around gender and Muslimness in that space. I really hope this is a conversation through forthcoming publications, etc., that we can continue over time. And again, thank you so much. I'm sure, again, our audience will have plenty of questions around all of this. So now we've got time for our audience questions. If you had anything that you wanted to ask the panelists, now is the time to do so. I think I'll begin with a question for you there, Peter. Rahila's Arts has asked for a little bit more information about the Scottish inquiry that you conducted. So Rahila wanted to know about the when did this take place, and specifically where in Glasgow did this take place, or was it perhaps broader? It'd be quite interesting to know if there were specificities within the Glasgow region in terms of the nature of racialization and Islamophobia that Scottish Muslims reported.
Yeah, no, that's really useful. So the inquiry opened up in the sort of middle of 2019, and so, you know, it ended up kind of overlapping with the start of the pandemic. So we didn't quite get it all done as quickly as we wanted to, because we kept it open for about a year or so to collect evidence. And we had submissions from all over Glasgow, including, I think, some of the areas that were mentioned, Pollock Shields, Govan Hill, Pollock Shaws and such like, as well as from other places that might be less likely to expect submissions from. But the nature of the data we got was that people didn't just talk about experiences of Islamophobia where they live. It was also where they work, or where they on train journeys into Glasgow city centre. So I don't think the nature of the data we've got is hard to say, well, look, we've got 20 responses from this specific postcode, and therefore this is what Islamophobia is like in this particular place. But certainly a lot of what that was a great presentation at the end there. A lot of the issues that were just discussed there about, I've called them managing everyday multicultural interactions and encounters, or even intimacies. There was a lot of that going on. People felt they had to do a lot of work to smile at people on the bus and to be nice to people and let them go first and all this sort of stuff in order to minimise the chance of these encounters sort of turning sour sort of thing. So the time frame was kind of mid-2019 into halfway through 2020, and then it took us a while to sort of actually write up the report.
Thank you, Peter. I think that potentially maybe that opens up further inquiry into then looking, I think the way we've got in London, looking at places like Tower Hamlets, whether or not we could draw some sort of parallels in the Scottish context as well. the idea of having to smile, and to me it reminded me of the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Got a question from Asa Smith as well, who wanted to ask Naaz and Victoria if they prefer the term anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, and why.
Okay, so I agreed to take that question. So I think there's obviously been a lot of debate around the term, and, Islamophobia, as a term can be critiqued because of the way that it's like, almost sort of justifying the fear of Muslims. But I think, my personal decision to use anti-Muslim racism is really about sort of drawing on the continuities with other forms of racism. And actually going back to Peter's paper about misrecognition, it's about the racism that you might experience as a Muslim. And I think a lot of the sort of hostility to the word Islamophobia often becomes, well, you can't critique religion. And that's not a debate that I think we're actually, talking about. So I think anti-Muslim racism is kind of clearer. And I think the APPG definition of Islamophobia talks about it as a form of racism. So I hope that answers the question.
I just add one thing to that, which is, we wrote about that in the article, obviously, because we're dealing with the kind of confluence of anti-Muslim racism and anti-South Asian racism, and specifically the way they come together. It made much more sense for us to focus on the degree to which anti-Muslim racism is a form of racism.
Absolutely. And I think potentially in both discussions, it's about centering either whether you call it Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism as a form of racism that is very much overlapping. And you talked about that confluence with other types of racisms. It is if you like, a part of the family of racisms, and then potentially work around countering and counter-narrative building emerges there. Asa, I'd also like you, and I think Naaz has mentioned it, to look at the APPG report, but also look at the Scottish Inquirer's very recent pieces of work that have done some of that interrogation around the terms, if that's something that's particularly interesting to you. Then coming on to, I guess, our next question, perhaps more of a technicality. Someone's also asked if we can share the paper, Naaz, Victoria, if that's been published yet.
Yeah.
And we'll hopefully do that and get that popped into the chat. If not, we'll share it afterwards via Twitter, I'm sure. Christina, a question that's come through for you. And I think it's potentially one that you might have preempted. Rahil's Arts talks about the issue of shame and being ostracized still being a very prominent issue amongst families of converts. I wondered if you wanted to add anything to that. I know you talked about the potential explanations around the reasons why your family had sort of, Rashid became the hidden Muslim. Wondered if you wanted to add anything there.
I think it's a difficult one, because if you look at the fact that he was working class and you look at the era that he grew up in particular, earlier on in that Victorian era, so for example in the 1870s to 80s, there was a lot more tolerance of religious difference, and that kind of changed as the century flipped over, and there became a lot more anti-Muslim rhetoric, and there was just less toleration all round of anybody that practiced a different spiritual direction. And particularly if you're from a working class community in the north of England that is completely reliant on the status quo and doffing your cap and not sticking your head above the parapet. So I think this is why this issue of shame was really strong in our family. And it wasn't, I wouldn't even say it was shame in that particular community. It's that we won't even go there. We won't even discuss that. And when we do, we'll put a different label on it, such as he doesn't drink alcohol, or he's a bit funny about what he eats. So it's like the level of shame and embarrassment and of wanting to be part of that community without being seen to be too different. I think he would have just been written off as being a little bit eccentric. Very similar to Lord Stanley. We think there might be a relation there. We're obviously the poor relatives if we are. who was very much perceived to be a bit weird and a bit different and a bit awkward and eccentric, and he did this Muslim thing. And thankfully, we're having these discussions now about people that have different beliefs and follow a different path to what is deemed to mainstream.
Absolutely. I think, it touches on these questions of othering and the levels of othering, that perhaps we can understand it along a spectrum rather than a sort of set binary. We've got a question from Leon Skerritt for Dr. Khan. Kamran, in terms of language and securitization, have you seen any similar ghettoization occurring with non-native white groups and language?
Thanks for the question. The research I do tends to focus on Muslims, so in that sense, it's not something I've been looking for. But that said, historically, that is something that's kind of been something that marks out particular communities. So if you go historically, you can see languages of Jewish communities, for example, and obviously the term ghetto comes from it has its kind of deep roots in the treatment of Jewish communities, I think, in Italy. So that's on the one hand. But that said, on the individual level, I mean, I don't know if you can think back far enough, not necessarily in terms of securitization, but in terms of intolerance, even towards to non-white, non-native white communities. We saw particularly we see these kind of hate crimes towards people speaking in other languages. And so sometimes that can be even a distinguishing feature in the hierarchies of whiteness sometimes, so so all of that is actually, they're all kind of pieces within the same picture, which kind of continue the kind of native speaker whiteness kind of normativity as kind of top of the hierarchy at times. So that's what I would say.
So I guess centering normative whiteness as part of that debate. I think there's the anecdote that always circulates about the person speaking Welsh and then being called out by another white person and actually telling them in Wales that I'm speaking Welsh and this is actually the indigenous language there. Maybe there are these hierarchies. Beyond continued his question, wanted to know a bit more about the lack of securitizing for far-right groups who are in an urban European context and are largely white.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think what's really interesting. So, for example, when I showed the counter-extremism strategy, and it talked about English language, because English language education, it's when we talk about extremism, it's clearly not being targeted at kind of far-right extremism. So, so I think one of the things with that is that we've seen it with the Prevent thing in the last couple of days. It's never seen as it's almost an individual issue of particular lone wolves or just a few bad apples or something that's seen as deviant. Whereas with Muslims, it's considered the logical end of being a practicing visible Muslim. So I think that's probably a lot to do with it.
Absolutely, and as you say, it's very topical right now. It's something that we're seeing. Perhaps it highlights problems, and I think many will agree with the policy rather than Muslimness. I just wanted to continue with some of our audience's observations and points. Ben talks about, and I think it's been discussed in Ben Whitham, Dr. Ben Whitham talks about the duplication of language and narrative between these different reports that we're seeing over time, but also draws back on Amani Hassani's paper last week that was given about this non-Western label in Danish policy and problematizing in particular Muslimness, but also racialized minorities. Is this the official label then in the Danish context, or is it perhaps a little bit more complicated than that?
As I understand it, it's used officially, and that's how they do the calculations on the populations of who's non-Western and how much of the ghetto they make up. It's also worth noticing that just the non-Western designation, it's basically Europe Canada, UK, Australia, and a few other non-EU countries. So it tells you a lot about who's Western as well, and their own kind of, who's within all of that. As I understand it as well, there's a generational aspect of it as well, in terms of it applies to your parents as well. So it's like it's clearly not about citizenship or nationality. It's clearly a kind of signifier of race, really.
I see parallels there within the francophone context, the issue d'immigration, the coming from immigration. So even if you are born in the quote unquote Western context and have full citizenship, this really isn't the benchmark. It's about heritage as well that comes into that. And arguably, I think we could argue not even how eloquently, quote unquote, one speaks English or the given language in a context. It really is about these potentially deeper and more historical signifiers around that. In terms of determining then who is Western, where does that boundary lie in the Danish context?
I'm going through my own learning journey. As I said, I think it's there's actually a definition of it, which is basically the EU plus a few countries and Australia, Canada, USA. It's very clear. It's very clear demarcation of that. I'm not sure how it applies in terms of daily life. I can only talk from experience at this point, where it's kind of different bureaucracies. There's so much contact with the state in terms of the way the welfare state works, if you work there and if you live there and opening a bank account and health. So all those designations probably have an effect when you're dealing with these kind of state level interactions through various intermediaries.
Thank you so much. Ben has replied, thanks, really interesting. He says it's a very explicit civilizational discourse to build into official statistics. Do we know of other examples in Europe even where this kind of very explicit terminology comes across? It tends to be more veiled in cases that I've studied on the continent. Don't know if any of you in your kind of international work have come across this. Perhaps there we're pointing to an exceptionalism of the Danish context and maybe a negative one in that, a bar being set. Ace has come in with another question. An APPG report was mentioned in relation to my question. Which one was it? He's in Sweden. I will get that link posted and shared to you. But the APPG report was from the All-Party Parliamentary Group report on British Muslims. The title of the report is Islamophobia Defined, and it brought in experts, people here on this panel now, but also people in the organising group of the Urban Muslimness event, to give evidence and present their research in this area to really come forward. In terms of that definition, it has been accepted by most parties in the UK, most political parties in the UK, save for example, the governing party and the more far-right parties. There are a number of councils as well, local councils, that have adopted the definition. So it's really an interesting piece to read and to kind of as a starting point for discussion as well. We have a question from Amani Hassani, one of our panelists from last week. She asks, Kamran, how have you noticed the difference in explicit racialization through this non-Westernness in Danish policies compared to the UK, which is much more implicit in its formulations? I think that touches on what we've really been getting at in our discussion.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's really interesting. I mean, obviously in the UK we have various other terms, the BME and all these terms that kind of point to these things and tease these things out. I think what's really interesting in the Danish case is, and it's a case in a lot of European countries, is this kind of avoiding talking about race at the same time, and this kind of racelessness, and it's almost about kind of the West and the non-West, and what we're really talking about is kind of effectively whiteness, attaching itself to ideas of Westernness or Europeanness. And I think that's this really interesting kind of kind of pulling in one way and pushing in the other, where it's very explicit through non-Western and Westerners, but then using words like whiteness and things, not only in discourse, but in policy, but in seems to be in public discourse, is very, very touchy, and it's really interesting. I think, especially compared to the UK, where a lot of these designations and conversations are perhaps a bit more kind of active, I would say, but no less powerful.
Absolutely. I think that, like you said, that there are these push and pull factors in the debate between the explicit and the implicit. We've got another couple of minutes if anybody did have any questions they wanted to put forward. Otherwise, I'll invite the panelists to ask each other if they had anything they wanted to raise.
I've just seen a question that's just come in about the image of Glasgow as an accepting pro-immigrant city. I think that's complete and utter rubbish. I think that's just a media story to do with the particular refugee issue that arose. I think the SNP are really effective at presenting this idea that Scotland's really accepting and welcoming. It's not. It's very racist. There's loads of racist incidents. It's just as horrible as anybody else. But I think there's this assumption that it's not, because they're very good at presenting this sort of this very particular form of civic nationalism. It really infuriates me, and a lot of people take it on and talk about it like it's an actual real thing. And there's Nicola Sturgeon's very good at it, and people believe what she says. So a lot of the challenges we've had through the cross-party group in the Scottish Parliament is that the SNP leadership just won't listen to any of the, we're always putting forward questions and asking them what they're doing to address Islamophobia in Scotland, and they just come out with the usual sort of couple of lines. Oh, we don't tolerate racism, Islamophobia, blah blah blah, and then they don't do anything about it. So we're trying different ways to get in to actually challenge get them to do some action and challenge this. So I do think it's an image, as you've said in your question. It is an image, but I think it's a false image. I don't think it's a pro-immigrant city at all.
Absolutely. I think it highlights the need to kind of interrogate within cases and even between cases. And I know the work I do sort of on France and Belgium. Belgium comes off looking great when you put it against the comparator of France and the very explicit kind of policies that exist there, particularly towards Muslim women, but also Muslim practices that we're seeing. But by no means does that mean Belgium is any way exempt from racism. In fact, there are just different developments that are coming out, and I think maybe there are parallels with the Scottish context, that it is perhaps about image generation. Leon has replied and said, "Love your honesty." Rahil's answers said, "When I lived there, I experienced racism, not because I was Asian or Muslim, but more because I was from England, and that this was before the SNP came into power." Perhaps, Rahila, and I think Peter might be able to answer this better, is this about the layers of racism that exist within the Scottish context?
Yeah, I would agree with that, and certainly if you're a British Pakistani with an English accent, you're really in trouble in Scotland, particularly if you've got a strong English accent. That's almost like you're almost the ultimate other. So it's one thing to be a Scottish Pakistani Muslim and sound like me. That's probably bad enough, but if you've got an English accent, there's a real, very explicit, overt form of racism, and the SNP and their sort of successes have really helped promote that. And it's really very everyday. A school on the south side of Glasgow that I went to, that I still do a lot of research in, my religious studies teacher's now the deputy head, and she's from Bolton originally, and she gets terrible comments made to her, especially when there's elections and things like that. So there are these different layers of discrimination against different groups, but particularly that, I would say that combination. I have interviewed a couple of people who've had really very explicit forms of racism directed at them because they're a Pakistani Muslim or South Asian Muslim, but they've also got the English accent thing. put on.
I guess it is that kind of multi-layered and intersecting, but also the kind of top-down signaling of the acceptable other that comes out, and the very real implications of all of that in terms of lived experiences of racism, particularly Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism. I don't know if we had any other questions. If anyone wants to ask the last moment or two to come forward with any questions. Any of the panelists, if you wanted to ask anything of your co-panelists, do fire away. We've got a couple of minutes. I think then on that note, I will begin to wrap up. I just wanted to begin by thanking our audience for tuning in, and those who will watch this afterwards as a recording. Thank you for taking the time to participate and to hear these excellent papers. Thank you to our panelists. We've had such an interesting wealth of stories, research, contexts, and sort of climates shared within this frame of urban Muslimness. We very much appreciate your contributions here. I also wanted to thank in particular the research centres and departments that have supported this event. So the University of Limerick, particularly the School of Sociology there, but also the Centre for Urban Research on Austerity at De Montfort University, who really is doing some of this cutting edge work on the urban and the racialized inequalities that are existent therein. And as you'll see on the bottom of our banner there, the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre, again, a centre based at De Montfort University, but really at the cutting edge of looking at some of these issues in the urban context and around racialization. Finally, I wanted to bring your attention to an event that we have organised that Christina mentioned, that both myself and Christina will be participating in. It's part of a month-long exhibition looking at Muslimness in the arts, in particular in the British context. That will take place at Milton Keynes Gallery. On the 28th of May, Christina will be giving an extended version of this talk, sharing the story in her book and the experiences of her family and around Robert Rashid. So if you are able to, please do come along to that. We'll share the link in the chat for that. There'll also be on that same day, on the 28th of May, in Milton Keynes Gallery, the screening of the film by Conor Ibrahim Frisha, which really looks at the northern English context and the interwoven stories of young British Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and some of the tensions that are at play there. So really accessible and emotive film. I do recommend coming along if you can to that. In the background, we've also got some comic art exhibitions there that are a permanent feature for this month alone. So please do consider. You can find the link to that with all of the times, dates, locations in that link that's just been shared by the DMU events team. So just really to finish off, I wanted to thank again the panelists, the audience, and the centres and universities supporting this event. Thank you ever so much.